Welcome, ladies and gentlemen from around the world. Thank you for joining the IIC annual conference. Frankly, this is a must-see panel, and I have the pleasure to welcome and greet Mr. Denis O'Brien, founder and chair of Digicel, and Mr. Mauricio Ramos, CEO and executive director of the board of Millicom. It also made more visible after 2 years that business as usual, including universal service funds as usual, or one-size-fits-all solutions or regulatory measures in spectrum management, in licensing, will not do the job of closing the access gap in developing countries. Private investment growth has slowed down, not stagnated, and governments' abilities to subsidize infrastructure in rural areas has ebbed, when so many other demands such as healthcare, vaccines, etc. are a priority right now and for 2 years now. As the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 clock is ticking, the countdown running, with huge challenges in thousands of unserved or underserved communities in the global south that can no longer wait for a global operator to connect them. And so therefore, local communities are relying more and more on smaller operators who are more sensitive to local needs and preferences. And even some communities are deciding to connect themselves using community networks that are self-managed by the otherwise unconnected communities. Both of our panelists here, this is very important thing I want to highlight, have become members of the Broadband Commission for the Sustainable Development, the commission created back in 2010 by ITU and UNESCO to address the challenges of universal internet access. And as members of the Broadband Commission, they have been active in the discussions about how to innovate the financing of these populations and areas that have yet to be connected under innovative or disruptive financing scheme. So this will help us enter and pass the microphones to our panelists so as to discuss how to close the digital divides sustainably without making the same mistakes of the past. So Denis and Mauricio, Digicel and Millicom have come a long way in serving small markets in developing countries for 2 decades. In many cases, places and serving populations where larger operations either were not serving or have packed their stuff and left. Lessons are to be learned from you, from small operators, especially now when we see this trend of increasing competition by smaller players or players in smaller countries. And what lessons should be taken into consideration by regulators and policymakers about not adopting one-size-fits-all regulation that are not fit for promoting investment of local or regional players. Denis, please.
Great. Thank you, Adriana. I suppose when you look at regulation around the world today, in my view, not that much has really changed, even though there's been a profound change in technology and the use of different access methodology for people to communicate. So, you know, we're looking at a model that maybe is 25 years old, but when you look at what is required today, I think there needs to be important new elements introduced into regulatory frameworks. The second thing is that if you look at developed countries in Europe, parts of South America, the US, and Asia, their regulatory models don't necessarily fit smaller countries, because smaller countries have different needs, but also, the economics of investing in a small island like Grenada or St. Lucia are completely different to investing in developed markets, very developed markets. So I think, a lighter touch regulation regime is probably more appropriate. But I suppose nowadays we're also, when you look at OTTs, they're providing exactly the same service, whether it's voice, video calling, or other products and services. They're the same, they're doing the same as us, but they don't have any regulatory framework. They don't fit into a regulatory framework. And that has been great for them, but bad for the industry and bad for countries, because if we're competing for a voice call and then on the same product basis as, say, WhatsApp or FaceTime, surely they also should come under some sort of regulatory framework whereby they pay local spectrum fees, local taxes, local corporations taxes, as we do. So if you're an operator in the Caribbean or in Central America, there's leakage of about 30% of revenues in terms of taxes, including, and also spectrum fees as well. So I think we need a new thinking around this. And this is something that I've been advocating for a very long time. But I think nowadays there is a coalition now of like-minded people that have come to the same conclusion, because OTTs need to be brought into some sort of a framework, and they need to be paying up like the rest of us in terms of all the economies that they operate in. And for example, in Haiti, Haiti is a country of 11 million people. Facebook has at least 5 or 6 million customers using Facebook every day. They pay no taxes. There's no sales tax. There's no payments to the Spectrum Management Agency. There's no corporation profit tax, and they employ absolutely nobody there. Whereas, we employ 1,200 people, 30,000 probably on a daily basis, selling, top up on that. And we pay, and we're very happy to pay into the central exchequer of Haiti, tens of millions of dollars every year. So I think we need new rules, we need new thinking. And I think it's great that this conference has been put together. And Adriana, given your own experience, you've seen the changes over 20 years, and we need to start looking at the next 20 years and how we can really change and spread the burden of regulation, if you like to call it, but also the protections of regulation across a greater, wider number of players. And whether they're, using a call and making a call over the internet or using a switch call, it's all the same.
What would you say? Would you agree with Denis in this distortion of regulatory regimes between infrastructure operators and OTTs, who, by the way, also have certain infrastructure, but not the kind that makes them pay taxes?
Sure. Thank you, Adriana, for having us join this phenomenal panel. And as always, it's good to see Denis, who indeed is one of the most respected entrepreneurs in this area. As you point out, TIGO, Millicom, we operate in 9 countries in Latin America, middle size, largely Central America, but also in Paraguay, in Colombia, and Bolivia, serving over 50 million mobile users and about 4.5 million fixed users. We're in both parts of the fixed and mobile broadband connectivity business. We've been in Latin America as a company for 30 years, building what we call those digital highways that indeed allow the many changes that have happened over the last 30 years. And I think you're showing those, and it's worth understanding how we are where we are today. When we first started this journey in Latin America, there was no iPhone, no Wi-Fi, social media was in its infancy, and we certainly didn't have the e-commerce that we have today, whether it's Amazon or Uber, et cetera, certainly not the content providers that, as Denis points out, are riding over the networks that we have built, whether it's Netflix or the many more that are coming. And over time, a tremendous amount of value has been created by these networks that have been built. These digital highways, whether they're mobile or fixed, Apple is worth a couple of $1 trillion. Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, they're all worth, each of them, a couple of $1 trillion. And you would wonder, why do I mention that? Because I do want to echo a little bit of what Denis is saying. Latin America has largely failed at creating these entrepreneurs, these $1 trillion companies that indeed have created a lot of value and yet are being widely used in our markets. And it makes me think of two things. One is, as we look going forward, how do we make sure that we provide the tools, those digital highways, that connectivity, so that entrepreneurs in the next 30 years come out of Honduras and Panama and Guatemala and the Caribbean or Colombia? What tools do they need? What tools can we give them so that they are the builders of the next digital wave? And number two, and this is extremely important, how do we create these robust networks that these entrepreneurs, that our companies in our market will need, these digital highways? And I think, as Denis was pointing out, we're business people. And the first thing we do is we follow the money. We try to understand what is the money wheel that really created and will need to be in place to continue to create this internet of the future, these digital highways that will make all of the future of the digital economies and market come to reality. By the measurement of the IDB, the region will need $20 billion to build mobile networks going forward in the region, and 50 to build fixed networks. That's a ton of money. And this money is not found in the markets where Denis or Millicom operate, or Digicel or Millicom operate. This money is financed from the international capital markets. I'll speak for ourselves. We're traded in Stockholm and we're traded in New York on the equity piece of our balance sheet. And we take over $8 billion of debt from these financial markets. So there's tens of billions of dollars just in Millicom that are being provided for the international markets. And as I sit here, I wonder how we're going to finance these development needs going forward. Let us remind ourselves that we are at 20-year lows for telco company valuations, a 20-year low for emerging market valuations, that we operate networks that have the same technology as those in Europe, but with much lower ARPUs. How do we find the monies from international banking and investment communities to help us finance the future of our digital economies? How do we get others, as Denis was suggesting, to share, to contribute, to pay up as well for the financing on the many digital highways that we still need to build? I think that's where we need to focus. We need to follow the money and make sure that the money wheel is understood, because these investors need a return in order for us to go back to them and say, Boston, New York, Stockholm, London, we need more money to go build more digital highways. So we need to make sure that we have proper spectrum and regulatory frameworks that allow us to continue to do what we've been doing for the last 30 years. That I urge us to focus, as Denis was suggesting.
So my question is, will the digital divide, especially the urban-rural digital divide, will it be actually bridged by whom? By small operators, by OTTs, in their partnerships with development banks, by community networks, by the traditional large, global operators like Telefonica, but Telefonica seems to be pulling out from Latin America and becoming more interested in other models, including content creation.
Well, if you look at the United States, it looks to me as if you've got 3 or 4 operators there that can self-finance, and all is emanated from net neutrality, really, where you know, you couldn't discriminate against one user over another user. And, you know, the US is moving away from net neutrality, thankfully now. But if you look at in developing markets and parts of South America and Central America and the Caribbean and parts of Asia, you know, there will be no broadband networks or fiber built into a lot of communities where the economics don't really justify that investment. So a fair solution would be for any company or user of a network that they would pay, you know, they would contribute to the economic cost of the network. So if for example, Netflix or WhatsApp, and they generate, you know, billions of dollars off using other people's networks, they should contribute a percentage of their revenues for the construction of networks. And it's kind of a modern version of USF funding. And it would be very simply implemented. So if WhatsApp got derived, you know, $20 million of revenue out of Jamaica for advertising, you know, to their users in Jamaica, and there's probably 2 million users. Well, then basically they would contribute a certain percentage of their revenues into a USF fund to help the construction of broadband networks. And, you know, heretofore, all these companies have been like butterflies. You know, you can never catch the butterfly because the net is not big enough or they're too high. But nowadays, you know, it would be very easy for regulators in every country in the world to force WhatsApp to register their business, have somebody responsible for their business in their country, and to also to freely make available their user information, number of users, and the amount of revenue that they generate in each country. And then it would be a simple mathematics then, where the regulator would say, well, the percentage of your revenues to go into the construction of networks into a fund, an infrastructure fund, is X percentage or a percentage of your ongoing revenues. So it's not very complicated, this, Adriana, and you do not need to be Archimedes to work it out. And, you know, we've spent, Mauricio and myself and many others on the UN Broadband Commission have spent virtually 10 years kind of fight for this, because if you look at Africa alone, about $450 billion is need in the, sorry, if you look at the world today, about 450 billion of new networks builds to bring broadband to people who are underserved. About half the population, 3.5 billion people in the world today, don't have access to broadband networks. And if we're ever going to move the needle, and we haven't moved the needle much in the last 10 years, and you bring it to say 6.5 billion out of 7 billion people, plus growth in population, well, then there needs to be completely new thinking, and everybody needs to contribute towards this. Now, beautifully, Facebook and Google are very silver-tongued, because they'll say, oh, we already spend money on infrastructure and our networks, but really that's their data centers so they can move data around the world. So it's not really, you know, they're not spending any money on enhancing networks. They're doing small projects, maybe in Peru and some other countries, but they're really kind of Walt Disney in the scheme of things. They're not really doing anything much. So we need kind of a new thinking, and that's why we're advocating now in this new working party, this new report that has been written, is that where people derive an income or an economic benefit, well, then they give a percentage of their revenues. And this would fund the payment of infrastructure, towers and fiber throughout Africa to underpopulated, uneconomic regions that don't have any coverage today. 40, 50 years ago, you know, you could run an economy without access to the internet. How can there be any economic development of any note in Mali or Chad or any of the Sahel countries across the middle of Africa unless there's access to broadband for everybody? And I'm not talking about 5 megabits, I'm talking about a minimum of 50 to 100 megabits. So, like, it's time for everybody to get on board with the thinking that Mauricio is talking about, our thinking, your thinking, and to say enough is enough. Let's go off and do something about it. And that's why kind of I'm appealing to all the regulators who may be coming to listen to people at this conference is, please come away from this conference with new thinking, because You know, the clock is ticking on the broadband deficit, and it's a human right for people to have broadband just the way it is drinking water.
Let me add a little bit of our views to that. I think the way we should look at this is, for this digital economies, the connectivity that our economies need to be sustainable into the future, we need to get everybody that's participating to contribute, everybody to chip in. And right now we have a model that is not, I think, sustainable. Money is not flowing from international investors into telcos. Money is not flowing from international investors into emerging markets. Yet we have to keep deploying the capital expenditures that will allow our economies to continue to connect to the international digital economy. At a point in time where it is the broadband operators that put in the capital expenditure, pay the taxes, pay the spectrum fees, and have to deal with tremendous amounts of competition from each other in the market. That ecosystem is not very sustainable in the long term unless we bring in other parties who can help finance it. And Denis has proposed a mechanism. I believe we need to make our ecosystem more sustainable going forward. And for that, we need to bring in different forms of financing for it, because the old ecosystem in which the broadband providers paid spectrum, paid taxes, provide phenomenal customer services is not one in which sustainability is assured. And let me just bring something up so that we understand the economics of this business and we stop thinking about it in terms of 2G or 3G regulation. In 2G or 3G regulation, the amount of capacity that these networks needed was very limited because it was largely voice. And an individual can only speak 24 hours a day. In today's world, individuals can continuously develop multiple sessions and demand more and more bandwidth. As a result of that, going forward, the demand on these networks is unlimited, truly unlimited. As a result, the investment cycles, the CapEx cycles, are increasingly more demanding. Therefore, we need more money to come into the system to keep this money wheel really working. We need to make this sustainable. And the old model, where the broadband operator pays for the CapEx, pays for the spectrum, and competes against 3 or 4 others with lower ARPUs, is not sustainable in an unlimited data model going forward. We need to, number one, get everybody to contribute. And we also need to change our thinking in other ways, by the way.
When is 5G going to go to the rural areas? Maybe in 50 years? Tell me, that's one. And the other one, spectrum. We do have to ask the uncomfortable question. Did our hosts and others, Nobel Prize winners, for their auction design for spectrum, and was it such a good idea? Haven't auctions been reducing competition because only the largest operators can pay those amount of money? So it's like promoting an oligopoly. Is it worth, in addition to spectrum fees that many countries levy besides the auction price? So is are auctions such a panacea, or we should revisit that?
Look, I think, you know, auctioning spectrum is a really bad business model, because anybody who goes to buy the spectrum is using up money that they should be rolling out network to probably areas that are not economic. You know, if you go and spend $50 to $100 million on spectrum, it's coming out of your build-out budget, and it's a really old way of thinking. And unfortunately, in South America and Central America, it has always been the way. And every 4 or 5 years, everybody has to go and spend more money on spectrum. But really, what regulators and governments should be saying that, okay, you make a promise in terms of the rollout of broadband to rural areas or people or to poor communities. And if you don't, well, then you have to come back and pay us for the spectrum. So it's a much more positive way of looking at things. So instead of charging 100 million for 5G spectrum, they should say, well, tell us what your build out plans, what you're prepared to commit to. And if you don't hit your plans, well, then we're going to fine you the equivalent amount of money that we thought we'd take off you in an auction. Now, that is a better way because it's using the capital. And as Mauricio very pertinently has put it, it's very expensive capital, because you're paying, 5-6% for money in the developing world, sometimes even higher. So this is a better model in my mind. The other thing is that we should be looking at LTE, first of all, because that propagates better and is less expensive. You need more towers, more nodes, more points of presence with 5G than you do for LTE. So I think we should be trying to get into a Ford rather than a Lamborghini initially, and then as everybody has greater needs for capacity, well, then obviously 5G can come into play. But we're not even at that. We're in the 4G world at the moment, and certainly I don't want to spend more money on 5G spectrum. It would be ridiculous.
Let me add a few things to that, Adriana, because I think you've asked really important questions, and Denis is bringing up some phenomenal points. Number one, on the notion of spectrum and spectrum auctions that maximize revenue to the government, I'm going to call that very old school as well. Very old school. And I want to say something and be humble about this, because we as an industry need to start being humble. That notion that spectrum could be paid at high valuation comes from the era in which telcos were cash cows and rich and making a bundle. And the reality is today, telcos are struggling to get investors to be excited about investing in our economies, struggling. Look at the valuations of telco in emerging markets. They are the lowest they have been in 20 years. Because these investment cycles never stop, and because there's no growth anymore. And as a result of that, pulling money away from the operators that are building these broadband networks is actually very old school. Like Denis is saying, government should be saying, contribute the spectrum back to who really owns it, the citizens, and have more deployment so that 4G can be put into place. So I do encourage individuals that have the ability to regulate to think of putting the spectrum to work for their citizens, rather than cashing out from a system that is no longer cash rich, is actually cash hungry. And the mechanism that Denis suggests is very well now known and certainly works better. Now, with regards to 4G and 5G, let's do this in order. Let's not forget that 5G is built, I mean, technologically built on 4G and a ton of fixed fiber in the ground. So it is actually a technological reality as much as a financial reality that you need to finish the job on 4G before you can launch on 5G. The countries that have done 5G have launched 4G 5 or 10 years ago and are at 4G penetrations that are 90 to 100%, have deployed a ton of fiber. We cannot really jumpstart 5G until we build that infrastructure of 4G, which, by the way, is moving fast. Most 4G auctions, and yes, there were auctions in our market, are years old, 1, 2, 5 years old, and we've built those networks very, very quickly. But 4G penetration is at best 50%, 60% in the more developed markets. So there's a lot of work still to be done. And in the meantime, we will learn a lot from 5G deployments that are successful and others that will not be so successful. And the prices of the ecosystem, including the handsets, will come down from unaffordable to affordable. Let's not forget for a second that the price of the handset that we sell in our markets, and I don't know, Denis, but I'm going to guess your markets are similar, is about $30 to $40. A 5G handset is $1,500 today. So there's no rush because nobody's going to be able to make a 5G call for some time. And I realize that what I'm saying may not be sexy. I realize that what I may be saying may not be super innovative, but we really have to finish the job we started. And let me go into a contentious item because, Adriana, I want to challenge you a little bit. And I want to hear everybody on this panel to hear me say this. The notion that more competitors is better for the consumer, I believe also needs to start to evolve and change. It is also a little bit old school. This notion that 4 or 5 mobile operators yield a better customer environment is true. Sure, it's true. In the short term, prices do come down, but investment gets sacrificed in the long term. And whereas in the days of 2G and 3G, where you had 5, 10 years to get a return on capital on your voice network, you could afford to have 4 networks in a given country. That is no longer true. It is not sustainable to think that you can have 4 mobile countries and small operators or medium-sized operators and still provide a return for that capital. So I believe that unless we change that mindset as well and understand that we must understand that it is better to have 2, maybe 3 very strong operators who keep investing and buying the spectrum, we're going to be left behind with a paradigm that's from the old days. Countries in Europe are beginning to change their mind. They realize they made a mistake. We're trying to have too many operators. America is also beginning to change its mind. We think we need to come to the idea that we're better off. Africa is also changing its mind. We're better off with 2, 3 operators that invest heavily than with many that bring prices down, but do not have the financial ability to buy spectrum and invest for the long term, because these are very short capital cycles. This we need to start changing our paradigm towards.
Absolutely, absolutely, and don't worry, many. The idea,
Adriana, if you look at the inflation in the cost of electricity over the last 10 years, it has been very significant for home users or business users. But if you look at telecommunications, there's been relatively no inflation. So what people spent 10 years ago is probably what they're spending today. So, you know, there's been very few price increases in reality over the last 10 years. And, you know, if we look at other industries, you know, all other industries got very significant price increases, but we still all have the same fixed costs. We've spectrum fees, we've sales taxes, we've everything else that goes along with that, plus a much more tighter cycle of investment. You know, Mauricio has mentioned between, you know, the 3G investment, the 4G, now 5G spectrum, etc. And it's unsustainable that companies like ours have to spend 18% of revenues every year on technology rollouts. It's just not going to work. And I suppose what I'm looking for, and I hope Mauricio, is that who are the regulators out there who are going to grab this problem by the horns and fix it? Because it's not going to work otherwise. I mean, we could talk about the business practices of Facebook, and we read every day the Wall Street Journal and different publications about what they've done with democracy, okay, and the threat that Facebook is to democracy and all those business practices. They need to be regulated. But if you look at purely the competitive services of OTTs versus our services in the telecommunications industry, they're the same. You know, it was interesting, the Korean regulator listened to the Korean operators because a lot of their networks capacity was being tied up because of the success of Netflix in Korea, in South Korea. And the regulator there said, hey, hold on, Mr. Netflix, you're going to have to contribute and pay for some of this network costs and the upgrade costs needed to carry your service, over the internet into people's homes or onto their mobile. So there are people around the world, and I think there is a coalition building, but we don't see much of it in the Caribbean. I'm not sure, Mauricio, do you see any near thinking in any of your markets? We need people to come on board with this concept.
I think the notion that really resonates with me is the notion of we gotta find ways to fix a model that is no longer working and needs new sources of financing. And the starting point for that, and you have here Denis, most successful entrepreneur in the region in many, many years, and myself telling you quite humbly, we're struggling. The system is struggling. We need to be less proud as telcos. We realize that we're big, but we're not getting a return. And I'm having trouble in Stockholm, in Boston, in New York, telling investors that there's a return here. Because the old days of cash flow rich telcos, high growth telcos are gone. And we have to make sure that is understood. We have to be humble about that as opposed to proud. Yes, we're big, but we're not getting a return. And that is a problem because remember the money wheel, it's getting broken. And that's where we and the regulators need to work together. Data is unlimited and it requires continuous CapEx cycles. ARPUs are getting pressured because the notion is still out there that more operators is better than less. But CapEx demands are actually increasing. Spectrum fees are actually increasing and the industry continues to get taxed. It is a broken model. And unless we speak out, it ain't gonna get fixed. And the first most important notion is for us to be humble and say, I'm having trouble, real trouble getting investors excited about why they should give us money to invest in Honduras and Guatemala and Colombia. Spectrum fees are high, taxes are high, no one else contributes into the ecosystem, and regulators still want more competitors thinking short-term that's really gonna help. Whereas the investment cycles and the investment needs are huge, and we need strong, robust companies. We need to change the thinking. Unless we speak out, it's not gonna get fixed.
What are those traits that you could teach global operators that are very good for global economies, but not for subsistence or local economies?
Well, I think, if you break it up, obviously the cheapest way of creating access to the internet is through wireless. But also fiber now is becoming, very competitive in terms of the cost of laying out fiber now using poles and other infrastructures that are already there. So, I'm sure Mauricio and TIGO and Millicom are rolling out fiber to communities that are viable, that will want high-speed internet, on a fixed basis, as we are doing in Jamaica and in most countries in the Caribbean. But it's the next level where it's not viable to lay fiber to the home, but people still want service. And you mentioned all these smaller companies, great, fantastic, but they should also, they're in a regulatory framework like the rest of us, but also they should get some, if Netflix is going into a home by one of these small operators with 3,000 customers, well, then Netflix should pay them something as a revenue share. So it just needs to be implemented, and this will actually push people to create coverage in areas that are uneconomic at the moment. So, if Netflix are getting a $5 ARPU and they have to give up 60, 70 cents a month, they will get more customers. I mean, it's not somebody, we're not into just taking revenues away from Netflix or WhatsApp. They will get something out of it by getting greater access, deeper access to customers and better access and more reliable access. So, there's lots of ways of doing this, and it's just a matter of implementing one government in the region say, well, I'm going to go off and do this. I'm aware of a number of governments in the Caribbean who are really seriously looking at this and seeing that, this has to change. So I'm sure in Central America and South America, where Mauricio is very strong, these kind of policies could be taken up as well.
Yeah. So a few comments.
I'm sorry, Mauricio, please.
No, I was gonna take it from what Denis said. I say this often. Our purpose, we've defined our purpose as a company, TIGO, Millicom, to build those digital highways that connect people and develop our communities. And we use the word digital highways because we really want regulators, amongst many others, to understand that this is digital infrastructure. It's infrastructure for development that we're playing and talking about here. It's the equivalent of ports and airports and highways. When coffee gets shipped out, or when onion and tomatoes get shipped out, when textiles and manufactured production gets shipped out or brought into the country, they use physical infrastructure. We are building the same in the digital economy. So it is very important that it be financed properly. And that is the point I think Denis is making and the point I'm making. Now, you ask, how are we different and what have we done that is different from other telcos in the world that makes us be, we're passionate about this, here we are, Denis and I, concerned about the future. So we're very passionate. We have managed to operate the same technology, which costs the same amount of dollars as the technology that operates in Europe and Asia and the US, but we do it at a fraction of the ARPU. Our ARPU is $7 against 115 in the US and 100 in Europe or so. It's the same technology. So we're very cost-efficient operators. When we talk to our peers, their jaw just drops. What do you mean your ARPU is $6? How is that possible? And here we are. And we've been extremely good at innovation. And I want to throw something in the mix here. Our companies, and TIGO in particular, has been at the forefront of deploying mobile financial payments, payment systems with your mobile phone. We've done it very successfully in Africa, where we operated, and now we have focused in Latin America. We're doing it with initial success in 5 countries in Latin America, in Paraguay, in Bolivia, in Guatemala, in Honduras, and in El Salvador. 5 million users that are using money on their phones just before Apple Pay, at the same time as Apple Pay. But here's the thing, and I know I'm speaking to a number of regulators. Think of telecom also as a mechanism to generate much more financial inclusion. In our markets, 70% of persons remain unbanked. They have no access to a bank because they're just nowhere near a small bank. My wife runs a small hotel in Palomino, Colombia. She just told me last week, the only bank in that small little town was just taken away. It's too expensive. 70% have no access to a bank. But our mobile networks, the one Denis runs in the Caribbean, in certain countries in Central America, has 99% population coverage. And we have a commercial distributions because we largely do prepaid, meaning tiendas, TIGO, that are in every small locality. And those little tiendas, because they do prepaid, move money around, cash around. Imagine the opportunity that there is for financial inclusion if we embrace mobile financial payments. And here's where regulation needs to be forward-looking. In every market, the mobile system is being hindered, blocked, tackled, delayed by those who have taken 30 years to not generate financial inclusion. So I urge us to think outside the box as regulators and allow Latin America and the Caribbean to be leaders in financial mobile payments. And for that, we need this industry to be allowed to include others that transact on mobile payments, tiny little amounts of money, but we cannot live outside of the financial inclusion opportunities. What's the point of giving them internet if we're not going to let them trade on it?
How will migration, massive migration, everywhere, Caribbean, Central America, we've seen it will have an impact, right?
Well, there's been a lot of people that have migrated from the Caribbean to the United States and Canada, over the last 20, 30 years, same to France and also the UK. And, I think both companies offer top up for sale in every mom and pop shop in New York or Florida. People want to send money from New York to somebody in Haiti. It's very easily done now, and it's a part of what the service that we provide. We think mobile money ultimately is going to be an added product and is an added product, but also it's going to be much cheaper to send money from the United States to Haiti or El Salvador in the future than going down to Western Union and paying probably 15% when you take two sides of the transaction. So I think that all that technology is changing. Obviously, there are know your customer KYC issues around that, but the technology and the way of doing it is very, very simple. And, we know our customers in Haiti, we know our customers in El Salvador. So, it can be done very, very easily. So I think that's a major plus in terms of moving money around for people who don't have a traditional bank account.
This is a very important topic, Adriana, and Denis is spot on. You can think of mobile money as international remittances, and sure, that's an important piece and it gets all the attention in the media. But the reality is that mobile money is an in-country, domestic reality that we need to foster and encourage. This is the fisherman in Honduras getting a little money. He takes it to a TIGO shop, puts it into TIGO money and sends it to his mom, who is 200 miles away, still within Honduras. And that is financial inclusion right there. That individual does not have a bank account and can effect a mobile money transaction seamlessly, securely, so no cash gets transferred around outside the realms of the existing mobile system, banking system. That's financial inclusion, safely, formally, and very cost effectively. Because there is those little mom and pops everywhere in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Paraguay. But we need to think of it in an innovative way. If we put in the same requirements that the traditional banking industry needs for much bigger transactions that happens in the cities, we're never going to develop this. Because these are small transactions. These are $10 transactions, $5 transactions happening every day. This is financial innovation in the making. We can show the world that mobile payment systems can work on these networks in these economies. And that's something that we need to, as companies and regulators, focus on. We cannot be thought of as banks, because we're not. And we cannot be thought of as individuals who are banking the same individuals who have been banked off for centuries. We're getting to El Pescador in Honduras.
We do not, and that they are affordable to users because they cannot afford to pay these high fees banks have.
I'll give you an example, Adriana, because Denis made a really good point about knowing our customers. When the government of Paraguay and the government of Honduras, when the government of El Salvador has needed to disburse relief funds, whether it's a hurricane or a flood, they come to us, to TIGO Money, and say, your customers, I want to reach Juan and Maria and Pedro, I want to send them this amount of money. And there's no bank over there to get them to them, and I don't want the cash to be lost. Sure. Boom, it goes. It's received immediately because we know the customers. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Just to add to what Mauricio is saying there, like telecoms regulators need to talk to central bank regulators, because central bank regulators are coming under the influence of the traditional banks who are trying to block financial inclusion and mobile financial services because, you know, they want to protect what they have, but they're not reaching the customers that TIGO or Digicel are reaching because they're not viable for them, but nevertheless, they want to stop us, you know, we're selling mobile financial services products. So, there's special interests here that need to be kind of re-educated.
Well, you see, there's resistance to new entrants in all industries.
Of course.
In the banking industry, who's particularly conservadora, certainly does not want any disruptive innovation.
No.
Gentlemen, this has been a super good, outstanding discussion. I'd love to continue it, but we will have to wrap up soon. So if you could, in a minute, tell us a bit, in a nutshell, what needs to be done both by spectrum-wise, by regulators, and also in the topic of collaboration for these digital highways that we all need.
Okay, well, a practical way of doing this, Adriana, is that in every country, the regulator brings a working group together of all the operators and everybody that's participating in the communications telecoms business, and invite the OTTs as well, don't exclude them, and to create a new framework, a new regulatory framework, a new way of financing the industry, a new structure on spectrum fees, USF funds, and a mechanism for everybody to contribute money to the build out of new networks, and also to give up this whole crazy spectrum auction that take place every couple of few years in some certain markets, and make people, if you get the spectrum, you have to roll it out, or else you lose the spectrum, or else you have to pay a very high fee for the spectrum retrospectively. So if there was a way of creating working groups in all the countries, and I think people will reach the same conclusion, is that, if you get an economic advantage, or if you get revenues through the rollout of broadband networks, well, then you contribute a certain percentage of your revenue base. So I suppose that's one way of doing it. Mauricio maybe have some other ideas.
Yeah, my last thoughts are, let's make sure the money wheel works going forward. The system that has worked so far, I'm afraid, is at stake going forward unless we find new ways to finance it. And that means getting everybody to contribute. That means rethinking how we charge for spectrum, who pays for taxes, and including how many operators does a country really need to have robust networks into the future. So make sure the money wheel works, get everybody to participate. Think of this as digital infrastructure. You wouldn't dream of having 3 or 4 aqueducts or electrical companies in every location. You would think of 1 or 2, and yet we think we need to have 3 or 4. So let's rethink that one as well going forward. Open the gates to financial inclusion and fintech. We cannot be the region where fintech does not ride on mobile telecom networks. And I love the way Denis presented this. Include us in a working group. Let's figure this one out, because quite humbly, we're not cash rich anymore. We really need to find ways to finance these digital highways going forward, or it will fail.
Everyone must be listened. Everyone should have a saying, including users, children, women, indigenous, unconnected communities, communities that are not the typical Western urban communities, innovative ways of financing. If we are to speak about digital inclusion, we must not leave anyone out. And every innovative way of investment and of collaborating These infrastructures, which are not commodities, but essential infrastructures, in my opinion, should be included. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you.
to IIC for facilitating this most relevant panel. Business as usual will not close the digital divide, and we need to think innovatively and unlearn the old models that are not real anymore. Thank you, Denis and Mauricio and ICC. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.